Many people will wake up bankrupt today. What should we do about it? It's unclear. Well,
overall, it's completely burned out.
Damn.
I already want this special military operation to just end, honestly. So many people are dying there. So many entrepreneurs are suffering. They're suffering.
Since the morning of July 22, Russians online for some reason have been whining and asking, why us? On the night of July 22, Ukrainian drones once again attacked the warehouses of Wildberries, the largest Russian marketplace, and that night the warehouses were burning in Krasnodar and Nevinomysk. This is a continuation of the same campaign that began on July 18, and according to the Russians' own estimates, it has already caused more damage than their annual budgets, the budgets of 53 Russian regions combined. In Krasnodar, the local Rospotrebnadzor issued a recommendation for residents to go outside less often and wear respirators because smoke from burning warehouses has covered the entire city. And it's already obvious that Ukraine has decided to systematically burn down all major Wildberries warehouses, just as it did with all the major oil refineries. Today in this episode, we'll take a detailed look at exactly where Ukrainian drones struck last night. How many warehouses have already burned down, and how many will burn in the future? What are the loss figures, and how are Russians and sellers who lost their goods crying about it? And most importantly, what is the strategy? Why are the armed forces of Ukraine systematically destroying the enemy's logistics and warehouses? And here we will rely not on speculation, but on the assessments of economists, including Russian ones, and statements from Ukrainian authorities. And at the end of the episode, I'll share two more pieces of news, ones that make Ukrainians proud and drive Russians into hysteria. In short, a Ukrainian F-16 has, for the first time in direct combat, destroyed an advanced Russian fighter jet. And Vladimir Putin, apparently wetting his pants, urgently put the new commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, Dropatov, on the wanted list. My name is Alexei Pichi. Let's discuss these topics together. But before we begin, please subscribe to this YouTube channel. We're getting close to 300,000 subscribers, so I'd personally appreciate it if you subscribed.
Fuck.
Yeah, let's step over to the building. Don't stand here.
Subtitles created by Eva Torzan.
Welcome, Kolovo Shaiba Holmes.
To our channel!
Thank you.
I don't get it. They're taking their car and leaving. Well, with the whole thing, yes.
Well, that's right.
Subtitles by Eva Torzan.
So, all across Russia, the largest warehouses of the Wildberries network continue to burn, and it's already obvious that Vladimir Putin simply has no defense against Ukrainian drones, and there won't be any. And Russians can only count on the mercy of Ukrainians. It all started back on July 18. Back then, our drones hit two Wildberries logistics hubs in Elektrostal near Moscow and in the city of Kotovsk-Tambov region. As a result, the warehouses burned down completely, and just the warehouse in Elektrostal alone is 250,000 square meters. And in total, about 350,000 square meters burned down that night in the Moscow region and Tambov region. To put it in perspective, that's about 50 football fields that turned to ash. Well, for example, Russian firefighters were only able to put out the fire in Electrostal after 3 days. According to the Russian side, 1 person died in Electrostal, and more than 1 person was injured. In Kotovsk, the night shift was hit. 7 people died, and another 24 were injured. The losses for just these 2 sites are estimated at $2.5 billion. And then, on the night of July 22, a new wave of strikes hit the Wildberries warehouses again. The Wildberries logistics centers in Krasnodar and Nevinomaisk, Stavropol Krai, were hit. The head of the company, Tatiana Kim, herself reported the attack on both warehouses. Both sites were evacuated, but there were still injuries. According to the governor of Stavropol, Vladimir Vladimirov, 5 people were injured in Nevinomisk, and a total of 13 people were injured at the 2 warehouses. Overall, my advice to Russians is to quit working at Wildberries warehouses as soon as possible. Because these strikes are not isolated attacks, and the Ukrainian armed forces will burn down all the major warehouses, don't even doubt it. After Putin failed to protect even the oil refineries, believe me, burning down the Wildberries warehouses will be much easier. So run, hide while you still can, because you will definitely burn there along with the goods. Look at the geography: the Moscow region, Tambov region, Krasnodar Krai, the Stavropol region. Ukrainian drones are targeting the enemy's logistics from the center of Russia all the way to the south. And that's not counting everything else. Let me remind you, in recent days there was an oil depot burning in Podolsk, the Southern Gates logistics hub in Domodedovo, an industrial zone near Lipetsk, a train station in the Rostov region, and so on. In other words, the work of the armed forces of Ukraine are operating across a fairly broad front. But behind these beautiful shots of whining Russians and burning warehouses lies the most pleasant thing: losses. Because the numbers turn out to be such that even Russian economists are holding their heads in disbelief. And here is the main estimate, which I mentioned yesterday and which only appeared in the Russian press today. The damage from the fires at the Wildberries warehouses exceeded the annual budgets of 53 Russian regions. 53 Russian regions receive less in a year than what burned down in just one night. In other words, a single blow to logistics burned more than the annual budget of each of 50 Russian regions. So, Vedomosti surveyed experts. The cost of the burned warehouses alone exceeds 20 billion rubles. That's just for the buildings themselves. But taking into account the equipment and goods, the total damage could reach 50 billion rubles. I want to emphasize, this doesn't include the warehouses that burned down last night and the night before. We're only talking about the warehouses in Electrostal and in the Tambov region, which were attacked on the first night, July 18th. The figure of 50 billion rubles is the losses for Wildberries alone. But the most interesting thing is the losses of the sellers, those very sellers who stored their goods in these warehouses. That is, the losses of ordinary Russians.
I can't hold back my tears anymore. Just now, 20 minutes ago, the Krasnodar warehouse was hit. Krasnodar warehouse is burning. Just imagine, there are so many of our goods there. I already want this special military operation to end already, honestly. So many people are dying there, so many entrepreneurs are suffering. Now we need to file the 7th, 6th month, half-year tax reports. I don't even know anymore.
I do it, you understand. I'm already like this.
I don't even know what to say anymore, but now the warehouse in Nevinomisk is burning too. That's near Krasnodar. That's the 3rd warehouse. Well, it turns out there was an attack at night on both Krasnodar and Nevinomisk. I'm in shock.
According to estimates, these losses could have exceeded 170 billion rubles. Now pay attention. The annual profit of the entire concern, the whole company Wildberries, for last year was 175 billion rubles. That is, hypothetically, if the company wants to honestly compensate the sellers for the lost goods, it would have to pay an amount comparable to its entire annual profit. Well, as you know, Wildberries, the company Wildberries, simply refused to compensate these unwashed wild Russians for any losses. The Russians were simply told off and told to go cry at home, but to forget about their money. Well, the Russians are crying, but they're doing it in a very strange way. The founder of Wildberries, Tatiana Kim, stated that the company is working on the possibility of compensating sellers who lost their goods. It certainly sounds noble, but there's a catch. 2 weeks before the attack, on July 7, an updated Wildberries agreement came into effect. And under this new agreement, the company removed its responsibility for the loss of goods as a result of drone attacks, missiles, and other munitions. By the way, if anything in Russia was at least somewhat consistent, I think Wildberries could be held criminally liable. Do you know why? Because when they adopted this new agreement, they discredited the Russian army in this way. In other words, the company absolutely did not believe that the Russian army would be able to protect them from attacks by Ukrainian drones, missiles, and other munitions. And the company, absolutely not believing in the Russian army, wrote into its terms that they would not compensate for any of this. This is discrediting the Russian army. In other words, they already doubted its effectiveness in advance, which, by the way, was the right thing to do. So, literally 2 weeks before the warehouses turned to ashes, Marketplace quietly changed the rules so they wouldn't have to pay for goods burned in drone strikes. Coincidence? Of course not. But behind the noble statement of that very Tatiana Kim lies the cynicism with which Russians rip off their own fellow citizens. Wildberries is already behaving quite strangely. In the seller's personal accounts, things just disappeared. Reports on the remaining goods that were in the burned warehouses. And these reports are the only thing that gives sellers hope of getting at least some compensation. As you can imagine, no data, no reports, no proof that your goods were even there. If there is no inventory report, it means it wasn't in the warehouse. According to the documents, nothing was in the burned warehouses. And it's unclear why these Russians are now crying on social media. And one more thing. In Krasnodar, after the strike, the regional health authority recommended that residents go outside less often and use respirators because of the fire at the warehouse. So, basically, the residents of a city with 1 million people are staying at home and breathing through masks because the logistics hub nearby is on fire. And just imagine what was in those warehouses. But I'm sure there could have been tons of plastic and chemicals there. And here's the cherry on top. Watch this so that you smile a little at the end. While the Wildberries warehouses are burning beautifully, while Russians are complaining on social media, Vladimir Putin has called an emergency meeting. Well, not to think about the Russian people, of course, no. Judging by the official record of his day, Vladimir Putin is busy with matters of state importance. Today, he congratulated Gazmanov and Eichmann on their milestone birthdays. Now, the main question is, why is Ukraine even burning Wildberries warehouses? And here I'm not relying on my own guesses, but on direct statements and expert assessments. Let's start with the official position. The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, confirmed the strikes on marketplace facilities and called them long-range sanctions. And the president of Ukraine explained the military reasoning behind them. The logistics centers were involved, I quote, in supplying the Russian army with drone components, navigation equipment, and gear. So these are not civilian warehouses, as Russian propaganda is now claiming. No, these are links in the military supply chain. And it seems the Russians have already forgotten, so I'll remind them. On June 25, Volodymyr Zelensky approved a 40-day influence operation by the Security Service of Ukraine aimed at Russia, with the goal of ending the war. The point is that for 40 days drones will be burning things. Simply burn Russia so that the wild Russians finally start to realize what they've actually done, where they've gotten involved, and who they've messed with. Even the Chechens told them what Jokhar Dudayev said, don't mess with Ukrainians or it will come back to haunt you so badly that you'll regret it for a very long time. They didn't listen. And now there's a 40-day campaign to force these Russians to finally start understanding something. And if you look at what's been happening in recent weeks, and this is the systematic destruction of oil refineries, oil depots, logistics hubs, ports, factories, and so on. So the picture becomes clear on its own. In other words, the point is a change in approach. The armed forces of Ukraine are not just destroying individual targets, but the entire supply routes of the Russian army. So it's not just one warehouse, but the enemy's ability to deliver anything to their soldiers. And today Bloomberg writes, The expansion of Ukrainian strikes on Russian logistics centers, if this turns out to be not a one-off action but a systematic campaign, clearly promises negative long-term consequences for the Russian economy. This is the answer to why the Kremlin is nervous, because an oil refinery can be somehow repaired in a few months. As for gasoline, of course, you can get down on your knees and ask Kazakhstan for it. But when all the logistics are disrupted, basically the entire consumer economy collapses at once. There are no goods, goods don't arrive, sellers go bankrupt, prices rise, inflation accelerates, and business confidence drops sharply. And all this is happening on top of the existing fuel crisis, the collapse of oil refining, and lines at gas stations. By the way, speaking of business confidence, there's some interesting news here too. Today's fresh news goes like this. The latest report showed that capital is fleeing Russia rapidly. Businesses are frantically trying to move their assets out of Russia. And this is the most honest indicator that business sees no prospects for continuing to operate in a Russia that has gone feral. Yeah. And at the end of the episode, a couple more news stories, so to speak, for dessert. Chairman of the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, shared some interesting news during a Senate hearing. A Ukrainian F-16 has shot down a Russian fighter jet in air combat for the first time. His direct quote, "Recently we witnessed the first air combat engagement in which a Ukrainian F-16 shot down a Russian fighter jet. Over the past few years, thanks to the support of many partners, Ukraine has significantly strengthened its layered defense system." He also noted that Ukraine's ability to scale up its multi-layered defense has greatly increased, from ground-to-air to air-to-air capabilities, and he specifically praised the work of the Ukrainian industrial base. This is, I emphasize, the first confirmed air battle where our F-16 shot down a Russian fighter jet. This means that the Russians will now be more cautious when approaching the front line. And the second piece of news, to lift your spirits a little at the end. Less than a day after Mikhail Dropatov was appointed the new commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs urgently put him on the wanted list. Well, apparently Putin got so scared, so frightened, that he said, "Put him on the wanted list immediately." So the logic of the Russians, brilliant in quotation marks. And it goes like this. We can't defeat him, meaning Dropatov, on the battlefield, but we can put him on the wanted list and tell Russians that he's the most dangerous terrorist in the world. Well, so that the Russian cattle really believe they're fighting against Nazis. And here you have Dropati, the main Nazi. It's like an excuse for the war they're waging. Let me remind you, Dropati is that very BMP commander who broke through the barricades in Mariupol in May 2014, led people out of the Izvarino encirclement, and thwarted the Russian offensive on Kharkiv. His first statement after being appointed was very brief. He said, "I will work with respect for people." And the minister, former defense minister Fedorov, called his appointment a new hope in the struggle of free people. Well, and here I should note that the so-called investigative committee of the Russian Federation claims that supposedly in 2017 and 2019 under Dropati's command, more than 70 shelling attacks on populated areas were carried out in the so-called DPR and LPR republics. Well, actually, after that, let me remind you, since 2022, Mikhail Dropati destroyed, I think, several tens of thousands of Russian soldiers who were never found, who just rotted away in the holy Ukrainian land. But Putin doesn't really care about those Russian soldiers. No, Dropati was put on the wanted list for crimes allegedly committed in some non-existent fictional republics invented by Putin. That's who he's thinking about, but as for those Russian soldiers rotting in Ukrainian soil, Putin doesn't care about them at all. Well, my God, thousands more, thousands less, what's the difference? In conclusion, Ukrainian drones continue to destroy the enemy's logistics. After Elektrostal and Kotovsk, Wildberries warehouses are burning in Krasnodar and Nevinomysk. About 350,000 square meters of warehouses have burned down. The damage has exceeded the annual budgets of 53 Russian regions. Sellers are losing up to 170 billion rubles. And Wildberries prudently rewrote its terms of service 2 weeks before the attacks so they wouldn't have to pay anyone for anything. People in Krasnodar are wearing respirators, and capital is fleeing from Russia. In general, the work of Ukraine's defense forces continues. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.